The year is 1579. Japan is burning. Warlords carve the land into pieces. Castles rise at dawn and fall by nightfall. Samurai patrol dust-choked roads with blades at their hips and death in their eyes. This is the Sengoku period, an age of fire, ambition, and blood. An age where a man could rise to glory or vanish from history in a single afternoon. And into this world, this violent, beautiful, impossible world, steps a man from Africa. He is tall, impossibly tall by Japanese standards. His skin is dark as midnight. His eyes are calm. His name is Yasuke. He has crossed oceans to be here. He has survived the unknown, and he is about to become something that Japan has never seen before and may never see again. This is not a myth. This is not a legend invented to comfort us. This happened. Welcome to A History in Color, where we bring the untold stories of Black history back to life. Today, we follow one man's extraordinary journey from the shores of Africa to the war-torn heart of feudal Japan. A story almost swallowed by time. A story that deserves to be told. Subscribe, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and step with us into the world of Yasuke, the Black Samurai. Nobody knows exactly where he was born. That mystery is part of what makes Yasuke so fascinating and so human. History has preserved his deeds, but stolen his beginnings. Some scholars point to Mozambique, others to the Congo. What every account agrees on is this: he came from a continent of kingdoms, trade networks, and deep civilization. A world that 16th century Japan knew almost nothing about. Africa in the 1500s was not the Africa of colonial imagination. It was a place of power. The Kingdom of Congo stretched across Central Africa with a sophisticated court and diplomatic networks reaching Europe. The Swahili coast hummed with Indian Ocean trade. Gold, ivory, silk, and ideas moved across the continent in every direction. Yasuke was born into this world, a world of movement, exchange, and ambition. But the same ocean currents that carried African trade also carried Portuguese ships. Portugal was expanding with terrifying speed. Their vessels crept along the African coastline, establishing ports, trading posts, and missions. With them came Jesuit priests, brilliant, calculating men who moved through cultures the way a blade moves through water. They collected languages, relationships, and people. And somewhere along that coast, they found Yasuke. He was remarkable enough to be noticed immediately. Jesuit letters written in 1581 describe him as extraordinarily tall and powerfully built, a man whose physical presence made everyone around him stop and stare. He became a servant and companion to Father Alessandro Valignano, the Italian Jesuit tasked with overseeing missions across Asia. Valignano was no ordinary priest. He was a cultural strategist, a man who understood that presence mattered, and Yasuke's presence was undeniable. The journey from Africa to Japan was not a voyage. It was an ordeal. Months at sea, the Indian Ocean's unpredictable rage, stops along the Mozambique coast, through the trading hubs of the East, across waters that most people never dared cross. Yasuke endured all of it: the heat, the storms, the disorientation of watching everything familiar disappear over the horizon. And somewhere in the middle of that crossing, he became something new. Not African anymore, not yet Japanese, but a man in between worlds, moving toward a destiny he couldn't have imagined. When the ship finally entered the harbor at Nagasaki around 1579, Yasuke stepped onto Japanese soil for the first time. He looked up at a land of mountains and mist, temples and tension, a country on the edge of transformation. And Japan looked back at him. Nagasaki was loud, and it smelled of fish and salt and smoke. The port was small, but growing fast. a Portuguese foothold in southern Japan where European ships unloaded silk, firearms, and foreign ideas. Japanese traders, fishermen, and officials moved through the docks in a controlled kind of chaos. It was a place accustomed to strangeness, but nothing had prepared Nagasaki for Yasuke. When he stepped off that ship, people stopped. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Children ran to get a closer look. Grown men stared with their mouths slightly open. He was taller than anyone they had ever seen, dark-skinned in a country that had rarely encountered an African man, and he moved. This is the part every account emphasizes, with absolute, unshakable calm. Not arrogance, not performance, just the quiet confidence of a man who had already crossed the world once and survived. The Jesuits had anticipated this reaction, but even they underestimated it. Crowds followed him through Nagasaki. Some reached out to touch his skin, convinced the color might be ink or soot. Some bowed deeply, unsure of what rank this towering stranger might hold. A few bolted outright. The chaos became a minor crisis. One Jesuit account describes mobs pressing in so tightly that Valignano had to physically clear the way. This was not the subtle entry of a servant. This was an event. But Yasuke was not rattled. He moved through the crowd like water through stone, present, observant, steady. From Nagasaki, the journey to Kyoto began. 900 kilometers of mountains, rivers, rice paddies, and narrow roads. Weeks of travel through a country at war with itself. Yasuke watched everything. The farmers bent double in the fields. The samurai on patrol with their hands resting near their swords. The roadside shrines where people left offerings for gods he'd never heard of. Every detail was a lesson. Every encounter was a classroom. He was learning Japan, absorbing it. By the time he reached Kyoto, he was no longer just a foreign servant arriving in a new city. He was a man who had studied a culture in motion, who had observed its rhythms and its tensions. He was ready, even if he didn't know it yet, for what was coming. Because in Kyoto, someone was already waiting to meet him. Someone who had heard the stories of the extraordinary African man traveling with the Jesuits. Someone whose curiosity burned as hot as the fires of war he had lit across Japan. Oda Nobunaga. Imagine the room. Stone floors. The smell of lacquered wood and candle smoke. Advisors and retainers lining the walls, hands folded, faces unreadable. And at the center, Oda Nobunaga. He was not a man you forgot. Born in 1534, Nobunaga had clawed his way to power through brilliance, brutality, and an absolute refusal to respect tradition. He was the first Japanese warlord to use firearms as a primary battle tactic. He burned monasteries that challenged his authority. He wore imported European velvet. He collected telescopes and clocks and foreign curiosities with the enthusiasm of a man who believed that the future belonged to whoever understood it first. He had heard about Yasuke before they ever met. The stories had been traveling faster than the man himself. A giant from Africa, dark as the night sky, with the composure of a monk and the build of a warlord. Nobunaga had demanded to see him. When Yasuke entered the room, Nobunaga stood up. According to Jesuit accounts, Nobunaga was immediately convinced that Yasuke's skin was painted, that this must be some elaborate performance, ink applied to simulate darkness. He ordered Yasuke to remove his shirt. He examined him closely, touched his skin with his own hands, and when he realized the color was real, that this man simply was this extraordinary, something shifted in Nobunaga's eyes. He laughed, not mockingly, delightedly, like a man who had just discovered something the rest of the world didn't know existed. Nobunaga began talking to him through Valignano's interpreter, asking questions rapid fire. Where are you from? How far did you travel? Have you fought? Can you fight? Yasuke answered each one steadily, without flinching or performing. And with every answer, Nobunaga's fascination deepened. This was not the reaction of a man seeing an oddity. This was the reaction of a man recognizing something rare. Within weeks, Nobunaga had made a decision that would shock his entire court. He offered Yasuke a place at his side, not as a servant, not as a display piece, as a samurai. The samurai class was not simply a job, it was an identity forged over generations, tied to bloodlines and clan loyalty, and a code of honor so demanding it governed even the way a warrior was permitted to die. For a foreigner, for an African man, to be offered entry into that class was extraordinary. Some of Nobunaga's retainers were outraged. Others were simply bewildered. Nobunaga didn't care. He gave Yasuke a house, a stipend, a ceremonial sword, and a new name, a Japanese name, Yasuke, given by the man who would become his lord. The black samurai had arrived. The morning started before dawn. That was the first thing Yasuke learned. A samurai's day began in darkness, stretching, breathing exercises, the careful ritual of checking and maintaining equipment. Before a sword was ever drawn in combat, it was polished. Before a battle was ever fought, it was planned 100 times in the mind. Yasuke threw himself into it. His physical gifts were obvious from the start. His reach was longer than any Japanese warrior training beside him. His grip strength was extraordinary. When he first lifted a nodachi, the great sword, other samurai whispered to each other that he made it look like a toy. His size, which had made him a spectacle in Nagasaki, now made him a force in the training yard. But Nobunaga wasn't interested in spectacle. He wanted a warrior, and Yasuke understood the difference. He trained not just his body but his mind. He studied Japanese military strategy, the placement of archers, the timing of cavalry charges, the art of reading a battlefield like a map. He sat in on council meetings, listening to arguments about troop movements and supply lines and the psychology of enemy commanders. He learned to read the subtle social codes of the court. Who spoke first? Who bowed lowest? What it meant when a man placed his hand near his sword during a conversation. Bushido, the way of the warrior, was less a rule book and more a way of existing in the world. It demanded absolute loyalty to your lord. It demanded composure under pressure that would break ordinary men. It demanded that you hold your fear in your hands and use it as fuel rather than letting it use you. Yasuke had been living a version of this code since he left Africa. He just didn't have a name for it yet. He became indispensable. Nobunaga brought him to public ceremonies, to diplomatic meetings with rival clans, to rides through the countryside inspecting fortifications. Yasuke's presence served a double purpose. He was genuinely capable, and he was visually undeniable. When Nobunaga appeared with this towering, dark-skinned warrior at his side, it sent a message to allies and enemies alike. I am not like the other warlords. I see the world differently. I draw strength from places you haven't even imagined. Other samurai watched Yasuke carefully, some with suspicion, some with grudging respect, some with outright admiration. He trained alongside men who had spent their entire lives preparing for war, and he matched them. He ate with them, drilled with them, sat with them in the quiet hours after training when men talk honestly about the things they're afraid of. His Japanese was improving rapidly. Within months, he could hold full conversations, argue about strategy, make jokes that landed. Language was another weapon, and he was mastering it. This was Yasuke's life now, not the life of a servant following missionaries from port to port. A life of purpose, structure, and belonging. In a foreign country, surrounded by people who had never seen anyone like him, he had found his place. War in Sengoku, Japan, was not the clean, honorable combat of legend. It was mud and smoke and screaming. It was siege camps that smelled of rot and fear. It was watching a castle burn from 300 meters away and knowing there were people inside. Yasuke rode into it with the rest of them. By the early 1580s, Nobunaga's campaign to unify Japan had entered its most aggressive phase. Province by province, rival daimyo were being crushed or absorbed. Battles erupted with little warning. Yasuke, now a fully integrated member of Nobunaga's forces, was expected to fight, and he did. His first major engagements were in the territories surrounding Kyoto and Owari province. These weren't the carefully choreographed duels of samurai mythology. They were coordinated military operations, infantry advancing in formation, archers releasing in volleys, and Nobunaga's signature innovation, firearms, fired in rotating ranks so the shooting never stopped. Yasuke fought within this system, learning to coordinate his movements with soldiers around him, to hold his position under arrow fire, to advance at exactly the right moment. The accounts from Jesuit observers describe the reaction of enemy soldiers seeing Yasuke on the field for the first time. They hesitated. Some stopped moving entirely. A towering African warrior in full Japanese armor, cutting through formations with a composure that seemed almost inhuman. It wasn't in any of the stories they'd been told about Nobunaga's forces. It broke their mental picture of what they were facing. Fear is a weapon, and Yasuke wielded it without trying. But he wasn't just a physical presence. Nobunaga began giving him leadership responsibilities, command of small units, responsibility for relay communications during chaotic engagements, the task of holding flanks while primary forces advanced. These were not ceremonial roles. In battle, a failure to hold a flank meant deaths. It meant losses. Nobunaga didn't give those responsibilities to men he didn't trust absolutely. The battlefield also deepened something in Yasuke. Combat strips everything away. All the ceremony, all the court politics, all the performance of status. What's left is clarity. You learn who you are when the arrows are falling. And what Yasuke discovered about himself in those chaotic fields was something he'd perhaps always known. He did not break. He had crossed oceans. He had stood before a warlord and been examined like a curiosity and not looked away. He had learned a language, mastered a sword, navigated a culture designed to exclude him. None of that had broken him, neither did this. When the smoke cleared and the surviving soldiers returned to camp, Yasuke was among them, steady, composed, alive. And every battle added another layer to his reputation. Not the reputation of a spectacle, the reputation of a warrior. June 21st, 1582. Before sunrise. Yasuke was awake when it started. Most samurai slept lightly. He heard it before he saw it, the unusual movement of large numbers of men in the darkness, horses, the jangle of armor being hastily buckled. Something was wrong. Hanaji was a temple in the heart of Kyoto. Nobunaga had been using it as a temporary residence during a military campaign. He had a small guard with him, nothing unusual. What none of them knew was that one of Nobunaga's most trusted generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, had spent weeks carefully turning his army against his own lord. When Mitsuhide's forces surrounded the temple, they numbered in the thousands. The small guard inside numbered in the dozens. The fighting began almost immediately. Yasuke was in it from the first moment, sword drawn, moving through the chaos. The temple's paper screens and wooden corridors, igniting around him as fires were set by Mitsuhide's soldiers. The courtyard became a killing ground. Men he had trained with, eaten with, fought beside, falling around him in the smoke-filled dark. Nobunaga fought too. He was not a man who waited for death to come to him. Contemporary accounts describe him taking up a naginata when his guards were cut down, fighting personally until he was wounded. Then, understanding that the situation was beyond recovery, he withdrew to an inner room and prepared himself for seppuku, the ritual death that would deny his enemies the satisfaction of capturing him. Yasuke was there, witnessing it, unable to stop it. He had pledged his life to this man, had crossed the world and found purpose here, in this court, under this lord. And now, Nobunaga was gone, not in a great final battle, but in a burning temple, betrayed by someone he had trusted. When the fighting ended, and Mitsuhide's men found Yasuke still standing among the wreckage, they were stunned. According to historical records, Mitsuhide ordered him brought forward. He studied the African samurai, this man who had kept fighting even as everything collapsed around him, and made a decision. He would not execute Yasuke. He was, Mitsuhide apparently declared, not a Japanese man, and therefore outside the obligations of samurai justice. Some historians read this as disrespect. Others read it as a strange form of recognition. A warlord confronting something he didn't have a category for and choosing to leave it alone. Either way, Yasuke lived. He walked out of the burning ruins of Hanoji carrying the weight of everything he had lost and everything he had proven. Japan was in freefall. Nobunaga's death left a vacuum that every surviving warlord immediately tried to fill. Alliances formed and broke within days. Armies that had been fighting against each other the week before suddenly found themselves on the same side. It was the most dangerous moment in decades, and Yasuke was in the middle of it, without a lord, without protection, without the anchor that had made his position in Japan possible. Mitsuhide held power for exactly 13 days. Then Toyotomi Hideyoshi, one of Nobunaga's most gifted generals, moved against him with staggering speed. At the Battle of Yamazaki, Mitsuhide was defeated and killed. Hideyoshi stepped into the power vacuum and began consolidating control. In a matter of weeks, the political landscape had completely transformed. Yasuke moved through this chaos with the same quality that had defined his life from the beginning: careful observation and precise adaptation. Historical records place him briefly in Hideyoshi's custody during this period. Hideyoshi was curious. You couldn't live in Nobunaga's court and not have heard endless stories about the African samurai. He assessed Yasuke with the same calculating eye he turned on everything. Was he a threat? No. A potential asset? Possibly. A problem? Not yet. Yasuke's survival depended on something more subtle than fighting skill now. It depended on reading rooms, on knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, on making himself useful without making himself threatening. He had learned these skills in Nobunaga's court, and he deployed them now in a world where the rules had changed overnight. Eventually, the records show he returned to the Jesuits, to Valignano, the man who had brought him here in the first place. In some ways, it was a full circle, and in other ways, it was the end of something that could never be reconstructed. The samurai life, the place at a great lord's side, the belonging he had carved out of a foreign culture through sheer force of skill and character. That chapter was closed, but what he had done could not be undone. He had been there. He had lived it. He had trained alongside Japan's finest warriors and matched them. He had fought in battles that shaped the country's history. He had stood in burning temples and not run. No one could take that from him. Not Mitsuhide, not Hideyoshi, not the erasure of time. Yasuke had existed fully, completely, extraordinarily, in a place and a time when someone like him was not supposed to exist at all. After the storm, silence. The 1580s in Japan were a time of consolidation. Hideyoshi was rebuilding the country in his own image, brilliant, ruthless, pragmatic. He would eventually unify Japan completely, achieving what Nobunaga had died trying to accomplish. Under his rule, society hardened. Social hierarchies became more rigid. A man's place was his place, and moving outside it required either extraordinary talent or extraordinary permission. For Yasuke, this new Japan was a different kind of challenge. He no longer had Nobunaga's explicit protection. He no longer had a domain or a formal role in a military hierarchy. The accounts from this period are frustratingly sparse. Jesuit letters mention him occasionally, describe his continued presence in Japan, note that he was respected, but the vivid narrative of battles and court ceremonies goes quiet. What we know is this: he survived. He moved through Hideyoshi's Japan with the same dignity and intelligence he had always carried. He remained with the Jesuits for a time, possibly serving in a role that drew on his knowledge of both African and Japanese cultures. He watched Japan transform around him: the construction projects, the military reorganization, the slow closing of borders that would eventually cut Japan off from the world almost entirely. He was a living relic of a different era. The age of Nobunaga, that wild, innovative, fire-lit period when a black man from Africa could become a samurai, was passing. Japan was becoming something more controlled, more inward-looking. But the stories persisted. They always do. In barracks and sack houses, in temple courtyards and along dusty roads, people still talked about the African warrior who had fought for Nobunaga. The story had taken on a life of its own, growing in some places, simplified in others, but never quite disappearing. Yasuke had become something Japan hadn't experienced before, and hasn't experienced since. A living legend while still alive to hear his own legend being told. At some point, the historical record simply stops. We don't know when Yasuke died, where he died, or who was with him. History closes its eyes for a moment, and when it opens them again, he is gone. What remains is the shape his life left in the world. The indentation of something extraordinary that passed through and didn't pretend to be anything less than what it was. For centuries, Yasuke was a ghost story. Scholars who found his name in Jesuit records assumed he must be a mistake, an exaggeration, a confused account of someone else, an African samurai in 16th century Japan. It defied the mental map most people carried of what history was supposed to look like. But the evidence was always there. Multiple Jesuit letters, independently written, describing the same man. Japanese chronicles mentioning the Kurojin, the black person, in Nobunaga's retinue. Consistent, detailed, corroborating. He wasn't a mistake. He was a man who had been forgotten because the world wasn't ready to remember him properly. That changed. In the 20th and 21st centuries, scholars began piecing Yasuke's story together with genuine rigor. Books were published. Academic papers examined the Jesuit sources. Japanese historians revisited the chronicles, and then the cultural wave hit. Novels, graphic novels, and anime series. Serious conversations about producing major films. A man dead for 4 centuries suddenly had an audience of millions. What does his story mean today? For people of African descent, Yasuke is something precious and rare. A historical figure who existed at the absolute intersection of black excellence and global adventure, centuries before the modern world. Not a victim, not a footnote. A warrior who earned respect in the most demanding warrior culture on earth. For Japan, he is a mirror, a reflection of a moment when the country was genuinely open, when one of its greatest leaders judged a man by his abilities and his character and his loyalty, and found him worthy of the highest honor available. For the rest of the world, he is a reminder that history is far stranger and richer and more connected than the version most of us were taught. The African diaspora didn't begin with the slave trade. African people were moving through the world, shaping events, appearing in places where they shouldn't have been. long before the modern era tried to flatten everything into a simpler story. Yasuke walked the streets of Kyoto in samurai armor. He trained with some of the most skilled warriors in Japanese history. He fought in battles that decided the fate of nations. He stood in a burning temple and refused to break. That happened. All of it happened. And it is ours. Part of the long, complicated, extraordinary story of what Black people have always been capable of, in every corner of the world, in every century of human history. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the journey, not the historical summary. The journey. A boy. We don't even know his name before Japan gave him one. Somewhere on the African coast. The ocean in front of him, enormous and indifferent. Everything he has ever known behind him. He doesn't know yet what's coming. He doesn't know about the warlord who will see him and immediately understand that he is something rare. He doesn't know about the sword that will be placed in his hands, the armor fitted to his impossible frame, the battles that will test everything he is made of. He just knows the ocean is wide, and he is going to cross it. That is courage in its purest form. Not the Hollywood version where a man knows he's the hero of the story. The real version, where you move forward anyway, in the dark with no promise of how it ends. Yasuke's life teaches us something that all the textbooks in the world can't quite capture. That human beings are not defined by where they start. They are defined by what they do with the road in front of them. He started as a servant. He became a warrior. He survived the fall of the most powerful lord in Japan. He endured a world that had no category for him and refused to make himself smaller to fit into one. His story doesn't have a neat ending. We don't know his last words, or his final home, or who grieved him. History gives us his deeds and then politely closes the door. But we have enough. We have enough to know that Yasuke was real. We have enough to know that he was magnificent. And we have enough to understand that the world has always been full of people like him, extraordinary individuals whose stories got misplaced, overlooked, or deliberately buried. People who crossed oceans and broke rules and refused to be invisible. People whose lives, if we take the time to find them, expand everything we thought we knew about what was possible. That is what A History in Color exists to do. Not to tell you that Black history is important. You already know that. To show you, with every frame, every image, every story, that Black history is everywhere. In the castles of Japan, in the courts of medieval Europe, in the scientific discoveries that powered the modern world, in the art and music and language that shaped every culture on earth. Yasuke is waiting in those records, in those letters, in those chronicles. A warrior in armor, standing perfectly still, waiting for the world to finally be ready to see him. We see him now. If this story moved you, share it. Comment below. Tell us where you're watching from and whose story you want us to uncover next. Subscribe to A History in Color and help us bring the past back to life.